In this episode, we are focusing on how to study for the CySA Plus in a way that is realistic, repeatable, and actually useful for a beginner who wants more than random bursts of motivation. A lot of learners start with energy, collect too many resources, and then quietly lose momentum because they never built a method for turning interest into progress. That happens especially often in cybersecurity because the field looks broad, technical, and full of people recommending 10 different paths at once. The good news is that effective preparation does not require perfect conditions, unlimited time, or a giant home lab on day one. What it does require is a sensible balance between learning the material, seeing examples of how it appears in the real world, and building study habits that help you come back to the material often enough for it to stick. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first idea to understand is that studying for CySA Plus is not only about memorizing security terms. That approach may help with a few isolated questions, but it will not prepare you well for an exam built around analysis, interpretation, and judgment. The certification expects you to think about logs, alerts, vulnerabilities, response actions, and communication in ways that connect rather than sit in separate mental boxes. Because of that, your study approach has to help you build relationships between concepts. When you learn about a vulnerability, you should also be thinking about how it might be detected, how it might be prioritized, what kind of risk it creates, and how it might be discussed with others. The more your study process reflects those natural connections, the less the material feels like a pile of separate chapters, and the more it starts to feel like one larger way of thinking. A beginner-friendly study plan starts by choosing a manageable set of resources instead of trying to consume everything available. Many learners waste energy hopping from one book to another, one video series to another, and one practice platform to another, thinking that more sources automatically produce better understanding. In reality, too many inputs often create confusion because the learner spends more time reorganizing the material than absorbing it. It is better to select a small number of resources that complement each other. One main learning source should explain the concepts clearly. One source of practice questions should help you test recall and interpretation. One place to take notes should become your personal record of what you understand, what still confuses you, and which themes keep reappearing. That kind of narrow, disciplined setup may feel less exciting at first, but it usually leads to steadier progress and far less frustration. The tools you use for study do not need to be complicated, but they do need to support clarity. A notebook, a simple document, or a note-taking app can all work if you use them consistently to capture definitions in your own words, summarize key ideas, and record mistakes you made during review. The key phrase there is in your own words, because copying polished definitions too closely can create the illusion of understanding without the reality of it. If you cannot explain a concept plainly to yourself, then you probably do not understand it well enough yet. You also want a way to revisit earlier material instead of just marching forward and forgetting what came before. That means your study tools should help you build a loop, not just a line. A loop brings old ideas back into view, strengthens weak areas, and helps you notice when concepts from different parts of the material are actually connected. Practice questions are useful, but only when you use them the right way. Many people treat them as a scorekeeping game instead of a learning tool, which leads to a shallow kind of preparation. They take a question, see whether they got it right, feel either pleased or annoyed, and then move on too quickly. A better approach is to treat each question as a small lesson about how the exam expects you to think. When you get one wrong, the answer is not just to memorize the correct option. You should ask what clue you missed, what concept you misunderstood, what wording led you in the wrong direction, and why the better answer is better in context. Even when you get one right, it is worth checking whether you chose correctly for the right reason or just recognized a familiar phrase. That kind of slower review builds far more exam readiness than rushing through a large number of questions for the sake of volume. Labs matter because CySA Plus is not purely abstract, but beginners should think about labs as places to observe and connect ideas rather than as places to prove advanced technical skill. A lab environment helps you see how systems behave, how logs look, how alerts can be triggered, and how different events create visible traces. That matters because many security concepts become much easier to remember once you have seen a simple version of them instead of only reading about them. The goal is not to build the most complex environment possible. The goal is to create a learning space where the concepts start feeling real. Even a modest lab can help you understand what an endpoint is doing, what a network event might represent, or how a suspicious action becomes something an analyst would actually notice. That kind of practical familiarity gives shape to the exam material without requiring you to become a full-time engineer while you study. When learners hear the word lab, they often imagine an expensive and highly technical setup full of enterprise-grade tools, multiple servers, and endless configuration complexity. That misconception stops many people before they begin. A study lab can start much smaller than that. What matters most is whether the environment allows you to explore core ideas safely and repeatedly. You want to see operating system behavior, user activity, network communication, security events, and simple examples of suspicious patterns or defensive controls. The educational value comes from observation and interpretation, not from impressing anyone with the scale of your setup. In fact, a smaller lab is often better for a beginner because it is easier to understand, easier to reset, and less likely to become a distracting side project. A lab should serve the study process, not become a second hobby that consumes all your available time and leaves little energy for actual exam preparation. It also helps to think carefully about which tools are worth your attention during preparation. CySA Plus is not a certification about mastering one specific vendor product, so the goal is not brand loyalty or deep platform specialization. Instead, you want broad familiarity with categories of tools and the types of data or functions they provide. You should be comfortable thinking about tools that collect logs, monitor endpoints, review network activity, scan for vulnerabilities, or support incident investigation. The most useful study question is not how to click through every menu in a particular interface, but what problem the tool helps solve, what sort of evidence it produces, and how an analyst might use that evidence to make a decision. Once you adopt that mindset, tools stop looking like separate technical islands and start looking like different windows into the same environment, each showing part of the larger defensive picture. Habits are often more important than enthusiasm, because enthusiasm rises and falls while habits keep you moving even on ordinary days. One of the strongest habits you can build is consistency of schedule. A learner who studies in shorter, steady sessions several times a week usually retains more than someone who disappears for days and then tries to compensate with a huge weekend push. That is partly because repetition strengthens memory, but it is also because regular contact with the material keeps your mental map fresh. You remain familiar with the language, the patterns, and the relationships between topics. Another powerful habit is active recall, which means forcing yourself to explain a concept without immediately looking at your notes. That moment of effort is where learning deepens. Reading something again may feel productive, but trying to bring it back from memory is often where the real progress happens. Another study habit that matters is reviewing mistakes without ego. Cybersecurity learners sometimes become emotionally attached to the idea that getting questions right proves they belong in the field, while getting them wrong means they do not. That mindset turns every missed question into a judgment on identity instead of an opportunity to improve understanding. A healthier approach is to treat mistakes as visibility into your weak spots. They show you where the edges of your knowledge are, which is exactly what you need before an exam. When you miss a question about logs, incidents, vulnerabilities, or communication, that is useful information, not a personal failure. The more honestly you study your errors, the more targeted your preparation becomes. Over time, that habit also helps with confidence, because your confidence starts resting on actual growth rather than on avoiding the discomfort of being wrong. It is also smart to build the habit of speaking concepts out loud, especially for an audio-first learner. CySA Plus covers ideas that sound simpler when spoken clearly than when buried inside dense notes. If you can explain the difference between an alert and an incident, or describe why a vulnerability score is not the whole story, or summarize why log data matters, then you are not just memorizing words. You are forming usable understanding. This habit can feel awkward at first, but it is one of the best ways to discover whether your knowledge is organized or scattered. If you stumble, ramble, or realize you are depending on vague phrases, that is a sign you need another pass through the material. Spoken review also helps because the exam expects recognition and reasoning under pressure, and those are easier when the ideas already feel natural in your own language. Another practical habit is to rotate between learning, reviewing, and applying instead of doing only one of those things for too long. If you only consume new information, your understanding stays shallow because nothing is reinforced. If you only review old notes, your progress slows because you are not expanding the map. If you only do questions, you may become skilled at test patterns without really strengthening your foundation. Rotation solves that problem. You might spend one session learning a topic, another session reviewing prior notes, and another session testing yourself on both old and new material. That kind of rhythm keeps your preparation balanced. It also reflects the way security knowledge works in practice, because analysts do not simply memorize facts once and move on. They revisit ideas, apply them in different contexts, and slowly become more fluent in how those ideas interact. One challenge many beginners face is knowing when they are actually improving. Because cybersecurity is full of unfamiliar language, progress can feel slow even when it is real. A good way to measure growth is to notice whether you are getting better at explaining relationships, not just definitions. Can you connect a vulnerability to risk? Can you connect a log event to possible attacker behavior? Can you connect an incident to the need for communication and escalation? Can you explain why one finding deserves faster attention than another? Those connections are the heart of analyst thinking. If your study habits are working, you will begin to feel less like you are collecting terms and more like you are understanding a living system. That shift is one of the strongest signs that your preparation is maturing in the right direction. As your exam day gets closer, your study process should become more focused rather than more frantic. This is where habits protect you from panic. A structured learner can review weak areas, revisit important patterns, keep doing targeted question practice, and maintain enough calm to think clearly. A disorganized learner often reacts by collecting even more materials and rushing through them, which creates the false comfort of activity without much retention. The final stretch of preparation is not the time to rebuild your whole process. It is the time to trust a good process, tighten it where needed, and keep showing up consistently. That may sound less dramatic than a last-minute cram session, but defensive certifications reward steady reasoning more than last-second intensity. You are trying to build a mind that can interpret and judge, not simply one that can survive a night of memorization. By the end of this discussion, the main thing to remember is that studying for CySA Plus works best when you treat it as the development of a professional mindset rather than a race through disconnected facts. The right tools are the ones that help you organize your thinking, revisit important ideas, and test your understanding honestly. The right labs are the ones that make concepts visible and concrete without overwhelming you. The right habits are the ones that keep you consistent, reflective, and willing to learn from mistakes. When those three pieces start working together, the material becomes less intimidating and much more coherent. Instead of feeling like you are trying to conquer a giant exam all at once, you begin to feel like you are gradually becoming the kind of analyst the exam is designed to recognize, and that is a much stronger place to study from.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.